The first time my mother-in-law tried to take my father's house from me, she was standing in his kitchen drinking coffee from his favorite mug. At the time, I didn't know that was what she was doing. I thought she was helping. That was Helen's greatest talent. She could make control sound like concern and cruelty sound like common sense. "You shouldn't be making decisions right now," she said, running one finger along the rim of the blue ceramic mug. "Grief makes people sentimental." My father had been gone for 11 days. His jacket was still hanging beside the back door. His reading glasses were still folded on the kitchen table beside the newspaper he never finished. Every room carried some small proof that he had expected to come home. I stood at the counter, sorting sympathy cards into two piles, people I knew and people whose names I couldn't place. "I'm not making any decisions," I said. Helen gave me the patient smile she usually reserved for children and waitresses. "That's exactly my point, Claire." My husband, Mark, was seated across from her, staring down at his phone. He had barely spoken since we arrived. For 10 years, I had mistaken his silence for peacekeeping. I understand it differently now. Silence can be a choice. Sometimes it means a person doesn't want conflict. Sometimes it means the conflict is already working in their favor. Helen looked around the kitchen as though she were mentally pricing everything. The walnut cabinets my father had built himself. The old farmhouse table with the burn mark from my 10th birthday cake. The narrow window over the sink, where he used to grow basil in a chipped red pot. "The place needs work," she said. "A lot of work. It's an old house. It's a financial burden. It's my home." The words came out before I could soften them. Helen's eyebrows lifted. I had lived in that house until I was 24. My father had raised me there after my mother died. He taught me how to change a tire in the gravel driveway, how to patch drywall, how to tell when tomatoes were ready to pick. Even after I married Mark and moved 40 minutes away, the house never stopped feeling like the place where I belonged. Helen set down the mug. "Your home is with your husband." There it was. Not loud, not openly insulting, just sharp enough to remind me that, in her mind, anything I had before Mark was supposed to matter less than anything connected to him. I looked at my husband. He finally glanced up. "Mom's just saying we need to be practical." "About what?" "The house. My father hasn't even had his memorial service." Helen sighed. "We're not trying to upset you. People usually say that right before they explain why your feelings are inconvenient." She stood and walked toward the window. Helen was 63, always perfectly dressed, even that morning in cream slacks and a pale gray sweater. Her silver blonde hair never seemed to move, no matter the weather. She looked elegant, respectable, safe. Most people loved her immediately. I had spent 10 years trying to become one of them. When Mark and I first got married, I believed Helen's criticism was simply her way of helping. She corrected the way I hosted Thanksgiving, the way I organized my kitchen, the way I spoke to contractors, even the way I folded Mark's dress shirts. She never raised her voice. She didn't need to. She could make me feel foolish with a pause. I kept telling myself that keeping the peace was a kind of strength. My father disagreed. A few months before he died, we had been sitting on the back porch while rain moved across the fields. "You give that woman too much room," he said. "Helen means well." Dad looked at me over the top of his coffee cup. "People who mean well don't always need you to feel small." I laughed it off. I wish I hadn't. That morning in his kitchen, Helen turned away from the window. "Has the attorney contacted you?" I stopped sorting the cards. "Mr. Bennett." "Is that his name?" She knew his name. My father had used the same attorney for 27 years. Helen had met him at least twice. "Yes," I said carefully. "He scheduled the will reading for Friday." Her eyes moved toward Mark. It was quick. Less than a second. But I saw it. Mark slipped his phone into his pocket. "We should all go," he said. "All. You, me, Mom. Helen isn't mentioned in Dad's estate." The room went quiet. Helen smiled again, but something had changed behind it. "Of course I'm not," she said. "I only thought you might need support." "I'll have Mark." Her eyes stayed on mine. Exactly. I didn't understand what she meant. Not then. Helen picked up her purse from the chair and walked toward the back door. "I'm going to look at the garden. It's mostly dead this time of year." "I know." She opened the door without asking. A cold October wind moved through the kitchen. Mark waited until she was outside before speaking. "You didn't have to be rude." I stared at him. Rude? She's trying to help us. Why is she asking about Dad's attorney? Because she worries. About me? About both of us. Mark stood and came closer, lowering his voice. "We have a mortgage, Claire. Your hours were cut last spring. This house could solve a lot of problems." I felt something tighten in my chest. "What problems?" He looked away. It was a small movement, the kind most people would have missed. But my father had raised me to notice when someone answered a question without speaking. "What problems, Mark? Nothing we need to discuss today." He kissed my forehead. I remember that more clearly than almost anything else. The casual way he did it, the confidence, the absolute certainty that I would let the conversation end because he wanted it to. Then he followed his mother outside. I remained alone in the kitchen. The house settled around me with its familiar sounds. Pipes ticking in the walls, wind pressing against the windows, the old refrigerator humming in the corner. I looked through the glass above the sink. Helen was standing beside my father's garden shed. Mark was with her. They weren't admiring the property. They were arguing. Helen said something I couldn't hear. Mark shook his head. She reached into her purse, removed a small object, and pressed it into his hand. He closed his fingers around it. Then he looked toward the house. I stepped away from the window before he could see me. For several seconds, I stood perfectly still. I told myself it could be anything. A coin, a piece of jewelry, a spare car key. But when they came back inside, Mark slipped something into his jacket pocket, and I heard the faint metallic sound of keys. Neither of them mentioned the garden. They left 20 minutes later. Helen hugged me at the door and held on longer than necessary. "You know, I only want what's best for this family," she whispered. I watched her walk to Mark's car. For the first time in 10 years, I didn't believe her. That evening, I locked the house and began turning off the lights. When I reached my father's study, I noticed the desk drawer was slightly open. I was certain I had closed it that morning. Inside, the folders had been moved. Nothing obvious was missing. His insurance papers were there, his bank statements, the deed to his truck. Then I saw the pale rectangle beneath the lamp where dust had been disturbed. Something had been taken. I searched the drawer twice before noticing a folded document on the floor behind the desk. It was a recent copy of the property record. My father's name appeared at the top. Beneath it was another name. Not mine, not Mark's. Helen Whitmore. My mother-in-law's name had been added to my father's house 6 weeks before he died. And beside it was a signature that looked almost exactly like his. Almost. I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was frightened, because my mind refused to accept what my eyes had already seen. I laid the property record on my father's desk and looked at it again under the warm light of his old reading lamp. Owner, Thomas Bennett. Then, beneath his name, Helen Whitmore, my mother-in-law. I traced the signature with my eyes. If someone had shown it to me a month earlier, I probably would have believed it was my father's handwriting. But fathers leave fingerprints on more than photographs. They leave them in habits, in tiny routines, in the way they sign their names. Dad never rushed his signature. He always paused before writing the second T in Bennett, almost lifting the pen completely off the page before finishing the last letters. This signature flowed too smoothly, too confidently. Someone had practiced it. I reached for one of his old tax folders and compared the signatures. Then another. Then another. By midnight, I had 7 documents spread across the desk. Every authentic signature carried the same tiny hesitation. The one on the property record didn't. My stomach tightened. Someone hadn't simply made a mistake. Someone had tried to become my father. I picked up my phone twice to call Mark. Twice I put it back down. Years earlier, I would have asked him to help me understand. Now, I needed to understand whether he already knew. The next morning, I drove back to our house before sunrise. Mark was still asleep, or pretending to be. His side of the bed was warm, but he kept his eyes closed when I walked into the room. "I thought you were staying at your dad's place," he mumbled. I couldn't sleep. Neither could he, apparently. He rolled over. "You look exhausted." "So do you." For a second, neither of us spoke. Marriage teaches you the language of silence long before it teaches you anything else. I showered, dressed, and made coffee. Mark joined me 20 minutes later. He watched me pour 2 mugs. You okay? I found something strange. He looked up immediately. What? A property document. His expression didn't change. What about it? I think one of Dad's files may have been moved. Only then did he relax. You've had a lot on your mind. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe. But relief had crossed his face before I ever mentioned what was actually on the document. That wasn't the reaction of someone hearing unexpected news. It was the reaction of someone afraid I already knew too much. He kissed my forehead before leaving for work. Don't spend all day worrying. The front door closed. His truck disappeared down the street. I waited exactly 5 minutes before grabbing my purse. Instead of driving to school where I taught history, I called the principal and requested a personal day. Then I headed straight downtown. The law office occupied the 3rd floor of an old brick building overlooking the courthouse square. Harold Bennett, not related to us despite the last name, had handled my father's legal affairs for nearly 3 decades. He stood to greet me the moment I entered. Claire. His handshake felt warm. His face didn't. I wasn't expecting to see you until Friday. I found something. His smile disappeared. Without another word, he led me into his office. I placed the property record on his desk. He adjusted his glasses, read the first page, then read it again. His eyebrows slowly pulled together. Where did you get this? In Dad's study. I've never seen this document. It has your firm's filing stamp. It does. He leaned back in his chair. Leave this with me. You think it's fake. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. He folded his hands. Claire. I know my father's signature. I believe you. That answer surprised me. Lawyers usually avoided certainty. He didn't. Instead, he unlocked a gray filing cabinet behind his desk. From inside, he removed a thick folder labeled simply Thomas Bennett Estate. He compared several pages in silence. Finally, he looked at me. Your father revised his estate 11 months ago. I know. I prepared every document personally. He tapped the property record. I did not prepare this one. The room suddenly felt smaller. What does that mean? It means I need to verify whether this document was ever legally recorded. I thought this copy came from county records. So did I. He reached for his phone. I'm calling the recorder's office. The conversation lasted less than 4 minutes. When he hung up, he remained silent for several seconds. What is it? I asked. He looked directly into my eyes. This deed was officially recorded 6 weeks ago. Without your office? Without my office? Can that happen? It shouldn't. The word settled heavily between us. Shouldn't, not couldn't. I stared at the document again. So someone actually filed it. It appears so, but Dad never told me. When was the last time your father visited the county offices? He didn't. You're certain? He was in chemotherapy. Harold nodded slowly. I thought so. Another silence. Then he asked a question I wasn't prepared for. Who benefits from this transfer? My mother-in-law. And after her? My husband. He didn't write anything down. He didn't need to. We both understood the implication. He closed the folder. I want you to do something difficult. What? Don't confront anyone. I almost laughed. I wasn't planning to. Good. He slid the property record into a new file. If this document is fraudulent, confronting them now only gives whoever created it time to prepare. You think there are others involved? I think fraud rarely happens alone. His secretary knocked softly before opening the door. Mr. Bennett, your 10:30 is here. He nodded, then turned back to me. I'll begin requesting certified copies this afternoon. How long? Hopefully a day. And if the signature is forged? His expression hardened. Then this story becomes much larger than a family disagreement. I stood. He walked me to the door. Just before I left, he spoke again. Claire. Yes? When your father updated his estate last year. I waited. He left me very specific instructions. What kind of instructions? Harold hesitated for the first time since I'd arrived. He told me that if anything unusual ever happened to the house, my pulse quickened. I was to open a sealed envelope. I stared at him. What envelope? He held my gaze. One your father specifically ordered me not to open unless someone tried to claim property that wasn't theirs. I felt every hair on my arm stand up. My father expected this. I don't know. Harold looked toward the locked filing cabinet. But I do know one thing. What? The envelope has been sitting in my safe for almost a year. And until yesterday... He paused. I never imagined I'd have to open it. The drive home felt longer than it ever had. Not because of traffic, because every mile gave my mind another chance to ask the same impossible question. Had my father known someone would eventually come after his house? He had always been practical, prepared, the kind of man who bought flashlights before storms and replaced smoke detector batteries every New Year's Day. But preparing for betrayal? That was different. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had almost convinced myself there had to be another explanation. Maybe the envelope contained nothing more than updated insurance papers. Maybe Dad had simply been overly cautious. Maybe. The front door opened before I reached the porch. Mark smiled as if nothing in the world had changed. You're home early. So are you. My afternoon meeting was canceled. He stepped aside so I could walk in. For 10 years, coming home had always felt like exhaling. That afternoon, it felt like walking into someone else's life. How was your day? He asked. Quiet. You went to school. I took a personal day. He nodded once. Good. You needed the rest. I watched him carefully, not because I wanted to catch him lying, because I wanted one honest moment. Just one. Instead, he walked into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator. What do you want for dinner? Such an ordinary question. It almost made me forget everything. Almost. I stopped by Mr. Bennett's office. His back stiffened, only for a heartbeat. Then he reached for a bottle of water. Oh? I had questions about Dad's estate. He twisted the cap. What did he say? He answered some of them. Mark took a long drink before speaking again. I've always hated dealing with lawyers. I waited. Nothing else came. No curiosity. No concern. Not even the obvious question. What questions? People who have nothing to hide usually ask for details. People protecting secrets often avoid them. I'll start dinner, I said. I can order takeout. No, I smiled. I'd rather cook. Cooking gave me an excuse to watch him without making it obvious. As I chopped onions, Mark sat at the kitchen island scrolling through his phone. Every few minutes he typed a message. Deleted it, typed again. His phone buzzed almost immediately after each one. Finally, he stood. I'm going to take a quick shower. The moment I heard the bathroom door close upstairs, I moved, not toward his office, toward the kitchen counter. His phone was still there, face down, unlocked. Mark had always trusted me with his password. Or maybe he had simply stopped believing I would ever look. I picked it up. One unread message waited at the top of the screen. Helen. Did she say anything? Beneath it. Mark's reply. Not yet. Another message appeared before my eyes. Keep her calm until Friday. My heart slowed instead of racing. Shock has a strange way of making everything feel quiet. Another text arrived. If Bennett mentions the house, call me immediately. I didn't have time to read more. The shower upstairs stopped. I placed the phone exactly where it had been. 3 seconds later, Mark walked back into the kitchen, drying his hair with a towel. You okay? I looked up from the cutting board. Why wouldn't I be? You seem distracted. I'm tired. He came behind me and kissed the top of my head. You've been carrying a lot. His voice sounded gentle, loving. If someone had walked into the kitchen right then, they would have seen a caring husband comforting his grieving wife. Appearances had always been Helen's favorite investment. She had taught her son well. That evening, after dinner, Mark said he needed to stop by his mother's house. She doesn't like being alone. Go. You don't mind? Of course not. He smiled. I won't be late. The second his truck disappeared, I grabbed my keys, not to follow him, to return to my father's house. The farmhouse greeted me with its familiar silence. I unlocked the front door and stood in the dark entryway for a long moment. Every visit made the house feel a little emptier, but somehow safer. I walked into Dad's study again. This time I wasn't looking for documents. I was looking for memories. If my father had expected something to happen, maybe he had left clues somewhere besides the lawyer's office. The bookshelves, the desk, the old filing cabinets, nothing. Then my eyes landed on the photograph sitting beside his favorite chair. It showed the two of us rebuilding the back porch 5 summers earlier. I smiled despite everything. Dad had refused to let contractors do the work. "If we build it ourselves," he'd said, "we'll know it'll last." I picked up the frame to wipe away a thin layer of dust. Something rattled. I frowned. The photograph shouldn't make noise. Turning it over, I found the backing had been taped shut instead of clipped into place. Dad never used tape unless he wanted something to stay hidden. Carefully, I peeled one corner back. A small brass key fell into my palm. No note. No explanation. Just a single old-fashioned key with the number 7 engraved into the metal. I stared at it. The study didn't have 7 drawers. The house didn't have 7 doors. So what did it open? I slipped the key into my pocket just as headlights swept across the front windows. Someone had pulled into the driveway. My pulse jumped. Mark wasn't supposed to know I was there. I quietly switched off the study lamp. The engine outside stopped. A car door opened, then another. 2 voices drifted through the night air. One belonged to Mark, the other to Helen. "What if she's already found it?" Helen whispered. "She hasn't," Mark answered. "How can you be sure?" "Because if she had—" He hesitated. "She wouldn't still be acting like this." I stood frozen in the darkness, one hand wrapped tightly around the small brass key inside my pocket. Then I heard Helen say the sentence that changed everything. "We have to get inside before she does." I stopped breathing. Not intentionally. My body simply forgot how. The brass key dug into my palm as I stood motionless in my father's dark study, listening to the 2 people I trusted most speak about his house as though it already belonged to them. "We have to get inside before she does," Helen repeated. Mark lowered his voice. "Keep yours down." "No one is here." "That doesn't mean we should be careless." Their footsteps crunched across the gravel driveway. A second later, I heard keys. Keys. Not knocking, not calling my name. Someone unlocked the front door. The old deadbolt clicked with a sound I had heard thousands of times growing up. Only this time, I wasn't the one holding the key. The front door creaked open. Helen entered first. "I told you we should have taken care of this sooner. And I told you to be patient." Patience almost always creates problems. I slipped behind the study door, leaving it barely open. From there, I could see part of the hallway without being seen. Helen walked past carrying a leather handbag tucked tightly under her arm. Mark closed the front door quietly behind them. "If Claire comes tomorrow—" "She won't. You don't know that. I know her." Helen smiled. The confidence in her voice chilled me. "She'll spend tomorrow grieving. She always needs time before making decisions." I realized something then. She hadn't simply judged me. She had studied me. For years. She knew how I reacted to stress. When I apologized, when I stayed silent, when I doubted myself. She had built a strategy around my personality. Mark looked toward the staircase. "We shouldn't be here. We'll be gone in 5 minutes." Helen walked directly toward my father's study. Toward me. I quietly stepped backward until I was pressed against the bookshelves. Every instinct screamed at me to confront them. To ask why. To demand answers. But another voice, my father's voice, echoed inside my memory. Never interrupt someone while they're showing you who they really are. The study door slowly opened. Helen switched on the desk lamp. Warm light filled the room. I stood hidden behind the tall oak bookcase my father had built when I was 12. I could see them through the narrow gap between the shelves. Helen went straight to the desk. "Someone's been in here." Mark looked around nervously. "Claire." "Probably." She opened the top drawer, then the second, then the third. Each movement became sharper, more impatient. "It isn't here." Mark swallowed. "Maybe Bennett already has it." "No. How do you know?" "Because Thomas never trusted lawyers completely." That caught my attention. Helen knew my father far better than I had ever realized. She walked toward the fireplace, ran her fingers across the mantel, checked behind framed photographs, inside empty boxes, even beneath the rug. She wasn't guessing. She knew something had been hidden. "What exactly are we looking for?" Mark whispered. Helen turned toward him. "The second key." The words struck me like cold water. I instinctively tightened my grip around the brass key inside my pocket. Second key? There was another one. What if Thomas moved it before he died? Mark asked. He didn't have the strength. You don't know that. I know because I visited him 2 days before the hospital admitted him. I frowned. She had never told me that. In fact, she had told me she couldn't visit because she had the flu. How many lies had been buried inside ordinary conversations over the years? Helen sighed impatiently. If we don't find it tonight, Bennett may. Mark rubbed the back of his neck. I still don't understand why Thomas would leave instructions. Helen looked at him with visible irritation. Because your father-in-law never trusted me. The room fell silent. Mark stared at her. You never told me that? It wasn't important. It sounds important now. Helen laughed softly. Thomas believed everyone had to earn their place in a family. And I wasn't interested in earning anything. There wasn't a trace of shame in her voice. Only annoyance, as if my father's caution had been an inconvenience instead of wisdom. She returned to the desk. This time she reached underneath the center drawer. Her fingers searched along the wood. Suddenly, click. A tiny, hidden compartment slid open. My heart nearly stopped. I had lived in this house for 24 years. I had never known it existed. Helen smiled triumphantly. I knew it. She reached inside, then froze. It's empty. Mark stepped closer. What? It was here. What was? She slowly turned toward him. The original deed. I felt the room tilt. The original deed, not a copy. The original. Helen slammed the compartment shut. Someone found it before us. Claire? I don't know. For the first time since they'd entered the house, uncertainty appeared on her face. Real uncertainty. She looked around the study again, slower this time, thinking, calculating. Then her eyes settled on the framed photograph beside my father's chair, the frame I had opened only minutes earlier. She walked toward it. Every step made my pulse pound harder. She picked it up, turned it over, examined the back. The fresh tear in the tape was impossible to miss. Helen's expression changed instantly. She whispered only 3 words. Oh. No. Mark frowned. What? She looked directly at him. She was here. When? Tonight? He looked around the room. Claire? Helen's eyes narrowed. She found something. My heartbeat became deafening. Mark took 1 step toward the bookcase where I was hiding. Then another. He was less than 10 feet away. 5, 3. I could hear his breathing. He reached out as if to look behind the shelves. And suddenly his phone rang. The loud sound shattered the silence. Mark flinched and pulled it from his pocket. The screen lit up. Harold Bennett. Both of them stared at the name. Neither answered. The phone rang until it stopped. A second later, another notification appeared. A voicemail. Helen's face lost every bit of color. She whispered in a voice I had never heard before. He's opening the envelope. Neither of them moved. Harold Bennett's name remained glowing on Mark's phone until the screen went dark. Helen was the first to breathe. Call him back, she whispered. Mark shook his head. No. What do you mean, no? If he's calling me, he already knows something. Helen's jaw tightened. He can't know. You don't know that. She looked toward the hidden compartment beneath my father's desk, then back at the photograph she had just examined. For the first time since I'd met her, Helen looked afraid. Not nervous. Afraid. There wasn't supposed to be anyone here tonight, she murmured. I stayed perfectly still behind the bookshelf. My legs ached. My fingers had gone numb around the brass key in my pocket, but I couldn't risk making a sound. Helen suddenly straightened her shoulders. We're leaving. That's it? Yes. We're not looking anymore? She snapped her eyes toward him. There was nothing left to find. Mark hesitated. What if Claire already has whatever was hidden? Helen stared at him for several long seconds. Then she said something that made my blood run cold. If she had it, she wouldn't understand what it means. They walked toward the door. Before leaving the study, Helen turned off the desk lamp. Darkness swallowed the room once again. A moment later, I heard the front door close. The lock clicked. Their footsteps faded across the porch. Then the engine started. I counted slowly. 1, 2, 3, until the sound of the car disappeared down the road. Only then did I let myself breathe. My knees nearly gave out. I sat in my father's chair and rested my head in my hands. Everything I believed about the last 10 years of my life had been quietly dismantled in less than 30 minutes. My husband hadn't simply known, he had helped. Helen hadn't simply disliked me. She had been planning something long before my father died. And somewhere inside all of this, there was an envelope my father had expected would one day be opened. I reached into my pocket and placed the small brass key on the desk. The number 7 stared back at me. "Where do you belong?" I whispered. The house answered with silence. Then, a memory. It wasn't dramatic, just one of those ordinary moments that suddenly become important years later. I was 16, helping Dad organize the garage after a spring storm. He had held up an old ring of keys and smiled. "Never throw away old keys." I had laughed. "Why not?" "Because people always remember the lock." He tapped my forehead with one finger. "They forget the door." At the time, I thought he was talking about tools. Now, I wasn't so sure. I stood and walked slowly through the house. The front hall, the pantry, the laundry room. Every door I could think of. Nothing fit. I almost gave up when I noticed something that had never caught my attention before. The grandfather clock in the living room. It had stopped working years ago. Dad never repaired it. He always said he liked it exactly the way it was. I knelt beside the wooden base. There, almost hidden beneath the trim, a tiny brass keyhole, much smaller than an ordinary lock. My heart began pounding. I slid the key inside. It fit perfectly. For a second, I couldn't bring myself to turn it. Whatever waited inside that clock had remained hidden because my father wanted it hidden. Opening it felt strangely final. I took a slow breath, then turned the key. A soft click echoed inside the old wood. Nothing happened. I frowned. Then I heard another sound, not in the clock. Behind it, the entire back panel shifted forward less than an inch. I carefully pulled it open. Inside rested a narrow metal box wrapped in brown paper. My father's handwriting covered the front. For Claire, beneath that, a second sentence. "If you're reading this, someone has already betrayed you." My eyes filled before I realized I was crying, not because of the betrayal, because somehow my father had known I would need to hear his voice one last time. With trembling hands, I untied the faded string around the package. Inside lay 3 items: a sealed handwritten letter, a small flash drive, and an old envelope marked in thick black ink, "Do not give this to anyone until Harold Bennett is present." I stared at it, confused. Why would Dad hide an envelope? That needed to be opened with his attorney. Then I noticed one final object lying beneath everything else, a photograph. It showed my father standing beside Helen. The picture had clearly been taken years before I met Mark. Both of them looked much younger. Neither of them was smiling. On the back, my father had written only 6 words. "This is where the lies began." I felt a chill spread through my entire body. Helen hadn't entered my life because I married her son. Somehow, my father had known her long before I ever did, and whatever history they shared, it was important enough for him to hide it until after his death. I didn't open the letter. Every instinct told me to. But the words written across the second envelope kept pulling my attention back. "Do not give this to anyone until Harold Bennett is present." My father had never been dramatic. If he left instructions, there was always a reason. I carefully placed everything back inside the metal box except the photograph. I couldn't stop looking at it. Helen looked almost 20 years younger. My father still had dark hair. They stood in front of what appeared to be an unfinished subdivision, both dressed in business clothes instead of the casual clothes I had always associated with him. It didn't make sense. Dad had been a carpenter his entire life. Helen had always told everyone she spent her career working in banking. So why were they standing together? And why did they both look so uncomfortable? I turned the photograph over again. This is where the lies began. Not, this is where your marriage began to fall apart. Not, this is where Helen betrayed us. The lies had started long before Mark and I ever met. I locked everything back inside the hidden compartment of the grandfather clock, keeping only the photograph in my purse. If someone returned to search the house again, I wanted them to believe they had already missed whatever they were looking for. The next morning, I called Harold Bennett before 8. "I need to see you." His voice was calm. "I was hoping you'd call." "I found something." "So did I." Those 4 words made me stop walking. "What do you mean?" "The certified records came in." "And?" "I'd rather explain in person." Less than an hour later, I was sitting across from him again. This time, the sealed envelope from my father rested on his desk. He didn't touch it immediately. Instead, he slid a certified copy of the property records toward me. I spent half the night comparing signatures. I looked at the pages. 3 signatures. My father's genuine signature. The signature from his will. And the signature transferring ownership to Helen. Even without legal training, the difference was obvious now. Harold pointed with his pen. "Notice the pressure here." I nodded. My father always pressed harder at the end. "Exactly." He moved to the forged document. "This one never changes pressure. So the person signing was copying the appearance of his signature." My throat tightened. "It's fake." Harold folded his hands. "I believe so." "Can you prove it?" "I believe we can." For the first time since this nightmare had begun, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel. Hope. Real hope. Harold then reached for another folder. This is what concerns me even more. Inside were copies of visitor logs from the county recorder's office. He pointed to a date. 6 weeks before my father's death. The deed wasn't submitted by your father. I looked at the signature line. Submitted by Margaret Whitmore. I blinked. Once, twice. Then looked again. Margaret. Not Helen. Not Mark. Margaret Whitmore. Helen's younger sister. A woman I had met exactly 3 times in 10 years. She lived in another state. "What does this mean?" I whispered. "It means Helen didn't file the documents herself." My mind raced. Why would her sister do it? I don't know. But whoever organized this. I finished the sentence for him. Made sure Helen's name stayed off the paperwork. Harold nodded. They planned carefully. Silence settled over the office. Then he placed both hands on the sealed envelope. "Claire, I know. You understand what opening this means. It means my father expected all of this. It means whatever is inside becomes evidence." I slowly nodded. "Open it." He carefully broke the old wax seal. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. He unfolded the first page. His eyes moved across the opening paragraphs. Then he stopped reading. Color slowly drained from his face. I had seen Harold Bennett remain calm through funerals, lawsuits, and bitter family disputes. I had never seen him look like this. "What is it?" I asked. He didn't answer. Instead, he quietly handed me the first page. At the very top, in my father's familiar handwriting, were the words, "Claire, if Helen Whitmore is trying to claim my house, then everything happened exactly as I feared." My hands began to tremble. Below that, another sentence, one that changed everything I thought I knew about my family. "Helen didn't choose your husband by accident. She spent years making sure you would marry him." I stared at the page. The words refused to make sense. Marry him. On purpose? That was impossible. Mark and I had met by chance at a charity fundraiser 12 years earlier. Or at least, that was the story I had believed for more than a decade. Harold quietly reached for the second page. Without taking his eyes off the letter, he whispered, "Claire." "Yes?" "I don't think your marriage was ever an accident." The room suddenly felt very cold. Outside the office window, people crossed the courthouse square, living ordinary Tuesday mornings, inside that office. My entire past had just become a carefully constructed lie, and I had only read the first page,